I need to tell this story before I lose the nerve to say it out loud. My name is Robert Dalton, and for 11 years I worked as a wildlife control officer for the state of Idaho, operating out of the Panhandle region near the Canadian border. My job was straightforward: relocate problem bears, track cougar sightings, investigate livestock kills, and generally serve as the bridge between wildlife and the ranching communities scattered across those vast stretches of forest and grassland. I was good at my work. I understood animal behavior, could read tracks and sign better than most, and I'd handled situations that would have sent younger officers running for backup. Nothing in those 11 years prepared me for what happened in October of 2019, and nothing that's happened since has helped me make sense of it. The call came in on a Tuesday morning from a rancher named Carl Hendricks, who ran cattle on about 400 acres bordering the Canixu National Forest. Carl was in his 70s, a third-generation rancher who'd seen everything these mountains could throw at him. When he called my office, his voice was steady, but there was something underneath it that I'd never heard from him before. He said he'd lost 3 calves in the past week, all of them taken at night, all of them killed in ways that didn't match any predator he knew. He said he'd found tracks that looked wrong and that whatever was taking his cattle was getting bolder. He asked if I could come out that afternoon and take a look. I told him I'd be there by 2. The drive to Carl's property took about 40 minutes from my office in Bonner's Ferry, winding through dense stands of pine and fir that opened occasionally into meadows where the autumn grass had gone gold and brown. The day was cold and clear, maybe 40 degrees, with that particular quality of light you get in October when the sun sits lower in the sky and everything looks sharper, more defined. I pulled into Carl's driveway just before 2 and found him waiting by his barn with his grandson Tyler, a young man in his mid-20s who helped run the ranch. Both of them looked tired, and when Carl shook my hand, his grip was firmer than usual, like he was reassuring himself I was actually there. We walked out to the pasture where the kills had occurred. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. Normally you'd hear birds, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the distant sound of cattle moving through the trees. That afternoon there was nothing but wind and the crunch of our boots on frost-stiffened grass. Carl led me to a spot near the tree line where the remains of the most recent calf lay partially covered with branches and forest debris. The pattern of the kill was immediately wrong. The calf's neck had been broken cleanly, with precision that didn't match the chaotic violence of a bear attack or the methodical efficiency of a cougar kill. There were claw marks along the flanks, deep parallel gouges that looked almost surgical, and the way the body had been positioned suggested it had been dragged a considerable distance before being cached. I took photographs and measurements while Carl and Tyler stood nearby watching the tree line. The tracks around the carcass were what bothered me most. They were canine in structure, showing clear pad marks and claw impressions, but the size was wrong and the stride length was impossible for any wolf or dog. Some of the prints showed all 4 feet on the ground in a pattern consistent with quadrupedal movement. Others showed only 2 prints, the rear feet with a stride length that suggested upright walking. I'd seen a lot of unusual tracks in my career, misshapen prints from injured animals, overlapping impressions that created optical illusions. But these were clear and distinct. Something had walked on 2 legs through this pasture and then dropped to all 4s, and the transition between gaits was visible in the soft earth. Carl asked me what I thought. I told him I needed to see the other kill sites before I made any assessment. We spent the next hour walking his property, examining 2 more carcasses and finding similar track patterns at each location. The kills were spread across his land, but all of them occurred within a few hundred yards of the forest boundary. Whatever was hunting his cattle was coming out of the national forest, taking what it wanted, and returning to the deep woods before dawn. The intelligence suggested by this pattern was what concerned me most. This wasn't opportunistic predation. This was systematic hunting with an understanding of territory, timing, and risk assessment. By the time we finished our survey, the sun was getting low and the temperature was dropping fast. Carl invited me back to the house for coffee, and as we walked, he told me something he hadn't mentioned on the phone. He said that for the past 2 weeks, he and Tyler had been hearing sounds at night that didn't match any animal they knew. Howls that started low and guttural like a wolf, but then shifted into something that sounded almost human, as if someone was trying to imitate a wolf but couldn't quite manage it. He said the sounds came from different locations, sometimes from the forest to the north, sometimes from the ridge to the east, like whatever was making them was moving around the property in a deliberate pattern. Tyler added that twice he'd seen something standing at the edge of the tree line just after sunset, too tall to be a bear, too broad to be a person, watching the ranch house from a distance before melting back into the shadows. I sat in Carl's kitchen drinking coffee that had gone cold while I listened to them describe these experiences, and I found myself believing them not because I wanted to, but because I'd seen the evidence with my own eyes and couldn't explain it any other way. I told them I'd file a report and request authorization for a trap and tranquilizer operation. If we could capture whatever was killing their livestock, we could identify it, assess whether it posed a broader threat, and determine the appropriate response. Carl asked how long the authorization would take. I said probably a week, maybe less if I emphasized the unusual nature of the kills. He looked at Tyler and then back at me and said he hoped it would be soon because he had the feeling they were being watched all the time now and that whatever was out there was getting closer. I drove back to Bonner's Ferry as darkness settled over the mountains, and I couldn't shake the sensation that I was carrying something with me from Carl's ranch. Some awareness that had attached itself during those hours examining tracks and carcasses. I kept checking my rear-view mirror, not because I expected to see anything, but because I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. The forest on either side of the road seemed darker than usual, more dense, and several times I thought I saw movement between the trees, something large pacing my vehicle before falling back into the darkness. The authorization came through faster than I expected. By Friday afternoon, I had approval for a capture operation using heavy-duty cage traps baited with deer carcasses. I contacted a colleague named Sarah Chen, who specialized in large predator capture and had access to tranquilizer equipment rated for animals up to 800 pounds. Sarah had worked with me on several difficult cases over the years, and I trusted her judgment and her nerve. When I explained the situation, leaving out the more unusual details about bipedal tracks and strange vocalizations, she agreed to assist. We scheduled the trap deployment for Monday morning, giving us the weekend to prepare equipment and coordinate with Carl. On Sunday evening, I drove back out to the ranch to finalize the trap locations. Carl met me at the gate looking worse than he had earlier in the week. He said the sounds had continued every night, growing louder and closer, and that the previous evening something had approached to within 50 yards of the ranch house. He'd turned on the exterior floods and seen something massive standing upright at the edge of the light, its eyes reflecting the illumination with an amber glow. It had stood there for perhaps 10 seconds, not moving, not reacting to the light or Carl's presence in the window, just watching the house with what he described as obvious intelligence. Then it had turned and walked back into the darkness on two legs, moving with a fluid grace that made his skin crawl. Tyler corroborated the account and added that he'd found fresh tracks that morning circling the house at a distance of about 30 yards. The tracks showed that whatever made them had completed a full circuit of the buildings, stopping occasionally as if examining the structures or looking for entry points. This behavior went beyond predation or territorial marking. This was reconnaissance, assessment, planning. I told Carl that we'd have traps in place by noon tomorrow, and that once we captured the animal, we'd transport it far from his property, and this would be over. I said this with more confidence than I felt, because the truth was I had no idea what we were dealing with, or whether standard wildlife management protocols would be adequate. Sarah arrived at the ranch Monday morning with her truck loaded with 3 heavy-gauge steel cage traps, each one measuring 8 feet long by 4 feet wide by 4 feet tall, rated for grizzly bear capture. We also had her tranquilizer rifle, a dart gun chambered for large doses of a sedative cocktail that could drop a 600-pound bear in under 3 minutes, and tracking collars in case we needed to monitor the animal after relocation. Carl and Tyler helped us transport the equipment to 3 locations we'd selected based on the pattern of kills and track concentrations. We baited each trap with road-killed deer that Sarah had obtained from the State Highway Department, positioning the carcasses at the rear of the cages so that anything entering would have to fully commit before triggering the drop gate mechanism. By early afternoon, the traps were set, and we'd positioned trail cameras at each location to monitor activity. Sarah asked me what I actually thought we were dealing with, and I found myself unable to give her a straight answer. I described the tracks, the kill patterns, the behavioral observations, and watched her expression shift from professional interest to confusion, and finally to something that might have been concern. She asked if I thought it could be a wolf-dog hybrid, maybe something that had escaped from a private collection or been released by someone who couldn't handle it anymore. I said that would explain some of what we were seeing, but not all of it. Not the size, not the intelligence, not the way it seemed to understand human patterns and technology. We agreed to check the traps at first light Tuesday morning and again at dusk. Carl said he'd monitor his property throughout the night and call immediately if he heard or saw anything unusual. As Sarah and I drove back toward town, she was quiet for a long time before finally saying that in 15 years of wildlife work she'd never seen tracks like the ones at Carl's ranch. She said the bipedal prints reminded her of something she'd read about in cryptozoology forums, reports from Michigan and Wisconsin about creatures that walked upright and had wolf-like heads, but she'd always dismissed those accounts as folklore or misidentification. She wasn't dismissing them anymore. Tuesday morning brought fog that hung in the valleys and made visibility difficult until the sun burned through around 9. Sarah and I returned to the ranch and checked each trap systematically. All 3 were undisturbed, the bait untouched, the surrounding area showing no fresh tracks or sign. We adjusted camera angles and reset the triggers, then returned to town to review the overnight footage. The cameras had captured deer, a black bear passing through one location, and several frames of what might have been a coyote, but nothing that matched what we were looking for. Sarah suggested we be patient, that large predators often took several days to investigate traps before committing to entering them. Wednesday and Thursday followed the same pattern. We checked traps morning and evening, found them undisturbed, reviewed camera footage that showed normal wildlife activity but nothing unusual. Carl reported that the nighttime sounds had stopped completely and that the oppressive feeling of being watched had lifted. Tyler said it felt like whatever had been stalking the ranch had disappeared or moved on to a different area. I wanted to believe this meant the problem had resolved itself, but something about the timing bothered me. The creature had been escalating its behavior, getting bolder, circling closer to human structures, and then suddenly it went completely silent, right when we set traps. That suggested awareness, understanding that the traps represented danger or capture. Friday morning, I arrived at the ranch just after dawn to find Carl standing in his driveway, staring toward the northern tree line. Before I could ask what was wrong, he pointed toward the ridge and said he'd heard something up there just before sunrise. Not the howling they'd heard before, but sounds like breaking branches, and what might have been vocalization, sharp barks or cries that echoed down into the valley. Sarah pulled in behind me and we loaded into my truck, bringing the tranquilizer rifle and driving as far as the logging roads would take us before continuing on foot. The tracks were everywhere once we reached the ridge, fresh prints from the previous night showing multiple animals moving together through the forest in what looked like coordinated travel. We found scat that was wrong in composition, too large for wolves and containing what appeared to be cattle hair and bone fragments. We found trees with bark stripped at heights of 7 and 8 feet, the wood beneath showing deep claw marks gouged into the living tissue. Sarah photographed everything while I tried to make sense of the patterns. The tracks suggested a group, maybe 3 or 4 individuals, moving together with purpose. They'd come down from higher elevations, traveled along the ridge, and then split up with different members heading in different directions. We followed the main trail for about a mile, moving slowly and staying alert. The forest was quiet again, that same unnatural silence I'd noticed during my first visit to Carl's ranch, as if every living thing had fled the area or gone into hiding. Around mid-morning, we found where the trail descended from the ridge into a steep ravine thick with old-growth timber and dense undergrowth. Sarah suggested we call for backup before going any further, but I wanted to see where the trail led, wanted to understand what we were tracking. We worked our way down into the ravine, using game trails and exposed roots for footing on the steep slope. The den was located in a natural cavity formed by fallen trees and large boulders, creating a sheltered space maybe 15 feet across and 6 feet high at its tallest point. The entrance showed heavy use, the ground worn smooth by repeated passage, and the smell that emerged from the darkness was powerful, a mix of animal musk and something sharper, that reminded me of the scent marking that wolves use for territory. Sarah and I approached carefully, and I used my flashlight to illuminate the interior. What I saw made no sense within my understanding of wildlife behavior. The space had been deliberately arranged with softer materials like moss and stripped bark creating bedding areas, and what looked like food caches positioned near the rear of the cavity. There were bones scattered throughout, some recent and some old, including cattle bones and deer remains, but also smaller bones that could have been from rabbits or other prey. What disturbed me most was evidence of tool use. Several large rocks had been positioned near the entrance as if to create a barrier or defensive position. Branches had been woven together in a rough lattice across one section of the opening. This wasn't a simple animal den. This was a constructed shelter showing planning and manipulation of the environment in ways that went far beyond instinct. Sarah was photographing everything when we heard the sound, distant but clear, a vocalization that started as a howl but shifted into something with almost human intonation. It came from up the ravine, back the way we'd traveled, and it was answered almost immediately by another call from a different direction to our east. We made the decision to leave immediately, moving back up the slope as quickly as the terrain allowed while trying to remain quiet. The calls continued, seeming to circle our position, and twice I thought I saw movement in the dense undergrowth, something large shadowing our path. We reached the truck without incident and drove back to the ranch, both of us shaken by what we'd found. I called my supervisor from Carl's house and explained that we'd located what appeared to be a den site and that the situation was more complex than a single problem animal. I requested additional personnel and suggested we might need to involve federal wildlife authorities given the unusual nature of what we were documenting. That afternoon, we moved the traps closer to the ravine, repositioning them along the trails we'd identified leading to and from the den site. We added more cameras and increased the bait loads, using multiple deer carcasses at each location. Sarah prepared several tranquilizer darts with maximum safe doses, and we established a watch schedule that would have one of us monitoring the trap cameras remotely throughout the night. Carl and Tyler agreed to stay in the house after dark and to call immediately if they saw or heard anything unusual. The capture happened just after midnight. I was monitoring the camera feeds from my office when I saw movement at trap location 2, the one we'd positioned closest to the main trail leading down from the ridge. The night vision showed something large approaching the trap with obvious caution, circling the cage twice before finally committing and entering to reach the bait. The animal moved on all fours, but its proportions were wrong, the front limbs too long and heavily muscled, the body too narrow through the hindquarters. When the drop gate triggered and the animal realized it was trapped, its reaction was not panic, but rage. It threw itself against the cage walls with tremendous force, and I could hear the metallic impacts through the camera's audio feed, even though the trap was over a mile from the nearest building. I called Sarah immediately, and we rendezvoused at the ranch within 20 minutes. Carl insisted on coming with us despite my objections, and the three of us drove up to the trap site with Sarah's tranquilizer rifle loaded and ready. The sounds from the trapped animal were audible from 100 yards away, a combination of snarling, howling, and something that sounded disturbingly like cursing or aggressive human vocalization. We approached with flashlights and found the trap rocking from the force of the creature's impacts against the cage walls. When our lights hit it fully, I saw what we'd actually caught, and my mind struggled to process what my eyes were showing me. It was massive, easily 400 pounds, covered in dark brown fur that was almost black in the artificial light. The body was built like a wolf, but scaled up impossibly large, with shoulders and chest development that suggested a lifetime of climbing and grappling. The head was the most disturbing element, clearly canine with a pronounced muzzle and ears that lay back against the skull, but the eyes were positioned more forward-facing than any wolf, providing binocular vision, and the intelligence in those eyes was unmistakable. It was not looking at us the way an animal looks at threats. It was assessing us the way another thinking being would, evaluating our weapons, our positions, our intentions. Sarah administered the tranquilizer dart from a safe distance, and we waited for the sedative to take effect. The creature's struggles gradually slowed over the next 3 minutes, its movements becoming uncoordinated before it finally collapsed in the corner of the trap, breathing heavily but unconscious. We waited an additional 5 minutes to ensure the sedation was complete, then carefully opened the trap and began the process of securing the animal for transport. Its fur was coarse and thick, the muscles beneath like steel cable, and even unconscious, it radiated a sense of power and danger that made every movement around it feel risky. We managed to get it loaded into Sarah's reinforced transport carrier, a heavy-duty unit designed for moving problem bears, and we sedated it with an additional dose to ensure it would remain unconscious during the drive. Carl stood nearby watching the entire process, and when we finally had the creature secured, he said something I haven't been able to forget. He said that in 74 years of living in these mountains, working this land, and dealing with every predator and threat the forest could produce, he'd never seen anything that frightened him the way this thing did. He said it looked at him with recognition, with understanding of what he was, and that he believed it had been stalking his ranch, not just for food, but because it was testing him, seeing how he would respond, learning about human behavior and vulnerability. We transported the creature to a secure holding facility that the state maintained for problem wildlife about 90 miles south of Bonner's Ferry. The plan was to keep it sedated while we conducted basic health assessments, took tissue samples for DNA analysis, and determined the appropriate long-term course of action. Sarah and I took shifts monitoring it overnight, and around 4 in the morning while I was alone with it in the holding area, it began to wake despite the sedation still in its system. The eyes opened slowly, those amber-colored eyes that caught and reflected the overhead lights, and it looked directly at me through the bars of the holding cage. There was no confusion, no disorientation that you'd expect from an animal waking from anesthesia. Just cold, focused awareness and what I can only describe as contempt. I administered another dose of sedative and waited for it to take effect, but something had changed in the way it looked at me. It had seen me clearly now, had my scent, had mapped my face and my fear response. When it finally slipped back into unconsciousness, I found myself thinking that we'd made a terrible mistake by capturing this thing, that some animals are meant to remain unknown and untouched, and that by bringing it into our world, we'd crossed a boundary that shouldn't have been crossed. The next morning, we conducted the assessment. The DNA results would take weeks to process, but the physical examination revealed characteristics that didn't match any known North American canine. The skeletal structure showed adaptations for both bipedal and quadrupedal movement. The paws had elongated digits that were almost hand-like with a partially opposable first digit. The dentition showed canines over 2 inches long with carnassial teeth designed for shearing meat. The brain case was large, suggesting significant cognitive capacity. Every measurement, every observation took us further from the category of known animal and into territory that none of us had training or framework to understand. It was Sarah who first mentioned the other calls we'd heard at the den site, the multiple vocalizations suggesting a group. She raised the question of what would happen when the others came looking for the one we'd captured, whether they would understand what had happened to their packmate, whether they would seek revenge or attempt rescue. I told her that was anthropomorphizing, projecting human concepts onto animal behavior, but even as I said it, I didn't believe it. I'd seen the intelligence in that creature's eyes. I'd seen the constructed den and the evidence of planning and tool use. These were not simple animals operating on instinct alone. The decision to destroy the creature came from levels above my authority. Federal wildlife officials reviewed our documentation and determined that the animal represented an unknown species or severe mutation that posed significant public safety concerns and that could potentially spread disease or genetic abnormalities if released. They ordered euthanasia and full necropsy, with tissue samples to be preserved for future study and the remains to be incinerated to prevent any possibility of exposure to pathogens. I argued against this decision, suggested that an unknown species deserved protection and study rather than destruction, but I was overruled and told that my role was field capture, not policy determination. They euthanized it on a Thursday morning while I was required to be present as the capturing officer. It took more sedative than should have been necessary, as if the creature's body was metabolizing the drugs faster than normal, and even at the end, as the final injection stopped its heart, its eyes remained open and fixed on me. I have dreams about those eyes now, amber-colored and filled with awareness, and in the dreams they belong not to an animal being put down, but to something that understood exactly what was happening and why. The necropsy revealed what we'd already suspected. This was something outside known taxonomy, something that had evolved or adapted in ways that blurred the lines between species and families. The tissue samples went to labs I've never heard of. The documentation was classified at levels that required security clearances I don't possess, and I was strongly encouraged to characterize the entire incident as a problem wolf capture and disposal. Sarah and I both signed non-disclosure agreements that prevent us from discussing specific details of what we found, and we were told that our cooperation would be appreciated and remembered when future promotions and assignments were considered. Carl's ranch had no further incidents after the capture. The nighttime vocalizations stopped, the oppressive feeling of being watched disappeared, and his cattle remained safe. But Carl himself changed after that week in October. He sold his herd within 6 months and moved to Coeur d'Alene to live with his daughter, telling people he was ready to retire, but telling me privately that he couldn't sleep on that property anymore, couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching from the tree line, waiting for the right moment to come back. I left the Wildlife Service 8 months later, and now work as a forestry consultant, a job that keeps me mostly in offices rather than deep woods. I still think about what we captured and what we destroyed, and I question whether we had the right to make those decisions. I think about the vocalizations we heard at the den site, the evidence of multiple animals moving together, and I wonder if the one we caught was part of a family or a pack. I wonder if the others knew what happened to it, if they understood the concept of capture and killing, and if somewhere in those mountains they still remember. The worst thing that happened wasn't the capture itself, or even the decision to destroy what we'd found. The worst thing was the realization that came to me about a month after the euthanasia, when I was reviewing my photographs and notes from the operation. I'd taken a picture of the holding facility on that final morning, a wide shot showing the cage and the surrounding area. In the background of that photograph, barely visible in the shadows near the tree line about 60 yards from the building, there are 2 figures standing upright, watching. The image quality isn't good enough to show details, but the shapes are clear, and the proportions are wrong for human, wrong for bear, wrong for anything except what we'd been holding inside. They'd followed us, they'd tracked their packmate to our facility, and they'd watched while we killed it. I've never shown that photograph to anyone else, never submitted it with my official documentation. I keep it locked in a safe deposit box along with my field notes from that week. And sometimes I take it out and study those shapes in the shadows, trying to convince myself they're just trees or equipment or tricks of light and failing every time, because I know what I'm looking at. I know they came for the one we captured, and I know they were too late. And I know that somewhere in the forests of northern Idaho, something that can think and plan and remember is still out there. And it knows what we did. I'm telling this now because I'm leaving the state, moving somewhere with less forest and more people, somewhere that feels safer even though I know safety is mostly illusion. I'm telling this because someone should know that we're not alone in those woods, that there are things living in the deep wilderness that possess intelligence we don't understand, and capabilities we can't match. And I'm telling this because every person who ventures into remote forest areas deserves to know that they might be watched, might be evaluated, might be seen by something that understands what they are and chooses whether to reveal itself or remain hidden. What we caught that October night should have stayed in the mountains. We should have left it alone, should have worked with Carl to better secure his livestock, and accepted that some losses are the price of living at the boundary between human settlement and true wilderness. Instead, we interfered, we captured, we studied, and we destroyed, and I believe we created enemies in the process, enemies with long memories and the intelligence to hold grudges and wait for opportunities. I don't go into the woods anymore after dark. I don't camp in remote areas or hike trails that take me far from roads and other people. And when I hear stories from other states, reports of dogmen or upright canines or wolves that act with disturbing intelligence, I find myself wondering if they're all connected somehow, if we're dealing with a species that's far more widespread than anyone suspects, and if the one we killed had relatives or packmates that might someday come looking for the people responsible. That's the thought that keeps me awake some nights, The possibility that somewhere in my past there's a debt that hasn't been settled, and that these creatures have better memories than we'd like to believe.